Hello, David Zaritsky for the Bond Experience. Welcome back. There are certain things that go together with James Bond. You've got martinis, you've got girls, and yes, you know how that sentence finishes. You've got guns. And I think today you're probably going to hear about the definitive book, the tome on James Bond guns, the guns of James Bond. And I'm inviting two people to the show that know all about that. Are they the preeminent experts in this field? They very might well be. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you or reintroduce you to Caleb and Ian. Gentlemen, welcome.
Howdy.
How we doing, David?
I'm doing good. Now, all right. So you got to explain to me right off the bat before we get into your journey, the book. Tell me about your background. Where are you?
Oh, we're in my office. We're at Forgotten Weapons Global HQ. So, of course, I have some French machine guns in the background.
My gosh, unbelievable. And Ian, you've got an amazing YouTube channel. It covers all the different social medias. Tell me about, before we even kick it off, because a lot of people know Caleb, tell us a little bit about you and your journey with this and how you even became involved with this book.
Okay, so I started almost 15 years ago running a website called Forgotten Weapons about the history and the mechanics and the stories of interesting and unusual firearms. And I've been doing that for a very long time now. And 6-7 years ago, I decided to write a book on French military rifles, which was my own personal collecting specialty. And there wasn't much written in English. And I figured, you know what? I can do this. And in the process of writing the book, I ended up partnering up with a magnificent photographer by the name of James Rupley, and we created a publishing company, the two of us and a third partner, Nick Jensen-Jones from Armament Research Services. We created Headstamp Publishing, initially to publish my book on French military rifles. The company has grown it's pretty cool. It's grown since then. We have 6 or 8 books now that we've published. And Caleb specifically approached James Rupley about wanting to work with us to publish his book on James Bond firearms. And James had already been following Caleb's Instagram account, knew who he was. James thought it was really cool. James approached me. He's like, hey, there's this guy who's all in on James Bond and knows he knows James Bond guns like French guns. And I think it'd be really cool for us to publish his book. Took very little arm twisting for me to be on board. I think it's a fantastically cool project. And it's been really cool seeing the draft and the layout of the book all come together. So I'm in here, I know some of the guns. I am not a James Bond specific firearms expert the way that Caleb is, but it's been really fun to be involved in the project. And I'm excited for the final product.
I love the beginning of this story because, first of all, we're storytellers here. My audience loves to hear the beginnings of these journeys. But they also see a very familiar looking character. Caleb has been a part of the Bond Experience show for many years. And I'll tell a semi-embarrassing story about Caleb.
Oh, good.
Caleb, when he was, I'll call him a fledgling content creator, was part of assisting on some of the Bond Experience stuff. And now he can't say this, but I can. He'll sound braggadocious. He's sort of the preeminent individual with James Bond weaponry in the world now. Brands seek him out. People have made him suits that have concealed weapons in them. I don't get offered suits like that. So he's bypassed me in any ways. When I heard, like you, Ian, when I heard that he was doing a book on this, immediately I became excited, not just for a friend doing this, but that the world was going to get something that was definitive and didn't exist. So Caleb, I'm going to give you finally a chance to open your mouth. Why did you feel the germ or the need to create this book?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. You're far too kind as always, my friend. It's to his point. I'd grown up in the firearms industry after being a James Bond fan my whole life. I grew up. My grandfather gifted me a 3-pack of the Ultimate James Bond DVD collection. Back when they were miscellaneously packaged, I think. So I think I had Goldfinger, Thunderball, and Diamonds Are Forever. And I only remember that because I was maybe 10 at the time. And I was wildly confused why James Bond suddenly had, eyebrows as thick as my grandfather and looked very unhappy where he was after Thunderball. It was very jarring even then. So grew up around all that. And I loved storytelling as well. I mean, that's why you and I connect and are friends too, right? I grew up in a world where I consider it to be, and I've said this many times, and the era of like young adult fiction and young adult literature. You know, I grew up, obviously there was like J.K. Rowling, but you also had like Rick Riordan with like the Percy Jackson series. You had, you know, Christopher Poloni. You had all these amazing, and then you had television. You know, you had Batman the Animated Series that was Emmy Award winning for phenomenal storytelling. So I grew up in a world that was shaped by these very passionate stories that were built for people like me. And then you start reading adult fiction and things like that as well. You know, get introduced to Fleming, and you realize there's this whole other world that exists outside of like that little niche. I mean, I remember buying my first James Bond book at the Scholastic Book Fair. Silverfin. I remember buying Silverfin, the Charlie Higson book, and that was like my first touch point with the literary Bond. And obviously, it was the young James Bond. But I say all that because to me, those stories were fascinating. I loved them so much. I remember being in middle school. Having the DK kids book, the red cover James Bond, Secret World of 007 book in my backpack. And I had scribbles and doodles and little stories that I was writing and imagining kind of sharing James Bond with my friends, because middle America, it wasn't exactly a big thing to care about. So I was kind of holding the flag for James Bond. And so I think for me, it became really easy to want to tell these types of stories. And so like with the Instagram, where I'm doing some photography and short form writing, and then you know, blog posts and writing things like that on the website. I enjoy telling those types of stories, and I enjoy folding in the nuanced layers to it. Like not just, hey, here's a gun, here's how it was used by Bond, and here's what he was wearing. Like that's great, but I don't think that fairly and accurately portrays everything that existed there, right? Like the real world history associated with that firearm, how it ended up in James Bond hands, the fact that James Bond's own weaponry and his equipment informed real world operators and vice versa, like fascinating stuff like that. And what I found when researching all of this was that in the firearms industry in general has this issue, and I think Ian can attest to this as well, is there's a lot of gatekept knowledge out there. There's a lot of things that people know as collectors and as aficionados that they don't share that information. They might be it's something that might come up with cocktails after you say the secret passcode, right? Like you've met them and you've known them for a couple of days or a few years, and you clink the glass or you wink the eye the right way, and then they start letting you in on these types of secrets. And I didn't like that. I want people to know about this stuff, and I want them to be just as excited about it as I am. So in order to do that, I couldn't just like do a small self-published tome, right? I mean, that was something I could have done a while back, and it would have been mediocre, and it would have been something that I wasn't satisfied with, I think is the best way to describe it. And Headstamp Publishing, James Rupley in particular, the guy that Ian mentioned who does the photography, they published a beautiful series of books called the Vicar's Guides. Giant coffee table books on white photography, beautiful covers, very minimalistic, very well done. And that was kind of the gold standard in the industry. And that's what I grew up when I was in the firearm shops. That's what people were referencing. That was the photography I was looking at and, you know, dreaming of accomplishing. And I remember I was driving up to visit my wife because she was still in grad school and I was back in Kansas City, and it was an hour back and forth. And I was on the phone with a friend, and I'm like, man, I really want to write a Vicar's Guide style James Bond book someday. 3 years later, I have the professional capacity where I can do so. And I pitched to these guys. So it's just a matter of, you know, it's a matter of when for me, when I wanted to be a writer. I mean, I wanted to do it my whole life. And this project was kind of a easy gateway drug because it's the intersection of two things that I've cared about for my whole life.
Yeah. No, I can see that happening. It's interesting too, because we talked a little bit about the inspiration or the why, a little bit about, you know, the how, you know, pairing up obviously with Ian and his team to make kind of the perfect bouillabaisse, the perfect, you know, secret ingredients of all of you. Let's talk a little bit about what this is.
Yeah,
because, you know, here's the thing, and I hope my audience is doing this. They hear about licensed troubleshooter, by the way. Awesome title.
Hey,
every Bond fan in the world. Yeah, every Bond fan in the world is absolutely going to get that in so many ways. I think I've even used that in my professional life. Probably shouldn't have. But the reality is that people should be doing a Roger Moore arched eyebrow right now going, a weapons guide. Hasn't there been a magazine? Hasn't there been a Walther PPK? And the reality is I started tapping my brain, and there really hasn't been a definitive version of what you've come out with. Is that why people should be paying attention to this?
I hope that's one of the reasons, right? Like there's been some great pieces out there from amazing collectors that have great private collections that I've used as reference material. Because, you know, this is like everything in the world. Like my bibliography right now, and we're still working on it. It's already 8 pages in length. Like this has been a uniform effort, taking us across the globe, taking me into so many primary sources. And so, you know, I'm a research nerd as just what I come from. You know, I not only am I a James Bond nerd, but I did debate for a decade of my life. Like, you know, in terms of like a pedigree of being a nerd, I've got it checked about 8 ways. And so, yeah, I consider this to be a definitive tome of the most important guns in the world of James Bond. Because when I made my initial list, I read all the Bond novels and the continuation novels last summer, head to toe, top to bottom, all in a row to create a master file. And it was well over 500 firearms that James Bond touches. Now, that would fill a library at the level of detail that we do here. Because it's not just here's a photo of the gun on one side of it, here's another, and here's 20 words a copy. You know, like we really stretched, I think, what's typically done with detail shots and lifestyle imagery. And also the more important thing for me is there hadn't been a volume that had celebrated the literary James Bond adequately with his tools. So, you know, the first half of this book is just on the literary James Bond, from Ian Fleming to, you know, John Gardner to Raymond Benson. Huge shout out to Raymond. He was willing to get on a few calls and do some interviews with me to help inform this
Good
book.
guy.
Amazing guy.
Yeah.
And his Boothroyd characters that he used to help inform him got on. So we did a lot of really cool pieces like that and carried through the whole and then made it our way into the cinematic Bond. And like I mentioned as well, not only is it about the weaponry and how it was used by James Bond, we also tracked down some really cool guys from the CIA, from the British Special Forces groups, from the DSS to the Navy SEALs and MACV-SOG, and talked to them about their use of Bond's tools in combat and their relationship with James Bond, like their story in relation to James Bond. It's just fascinating information.
I think there's a really cool crossover with this book where a lot of the people who are deep into James Bond, but not deep into firearms specifically or in general, they probably don't recognize just how significant some of the real world background stories are behind some of the guns that Bond is using and behind like the whole context of Bond's firearms. And at the same time, I think there are a lot of people who are very heavily into firearms history who don't realize the depth and the complexity of the guns in James Bond. Like, this isn't specific to your audience, but there are a lot of people out there, like the sort of people I tend to hang out with more often, who think, oh, guns of James Bond, that's a PPK.
Right. How many pages can you fill with PPK pictures?
Exactly. And maybe some of them know about a Beretta.
Mm-hmm.
Probably don't really think about, like, I don't know, some Beretta something. And then nothing, like they don't know any of the rest of the story. And especially when you get into the literary Bond, it's such an interesting series of the firearms are so informative of the time and place where the books were written and where the books are set. There's a tremendous amount, I think, of fantastically interesting information that goes so far beyond, oh, it's Sean Connery with PPK.
I'm glad you're peeling away the layers, because it's a Bond channel, so I'll say it like this. Yeah. There's a danger in people looking at this and going, okay, this is for gun aficionados. Like you're saying, Ian, you put it perfectly. The reality is this kind of straddles the line. I mean, this is going to satisfy all the different creatures. But for those of you uninitiated that haven't read the synopsis or the press blurb, this is a recounting that happens to tell stories from a literary standpoint, like you said, movie, film, real life. That's what I meant by definitive. It's not that, oh, this has every gun. Yes,
right.
It has that. But I'm talking about, let's call it story weaving, the way you weave stories of actual people. If you are not, quote unquote, into guns, even though if you're a Bond fan, and I've always said this, whether you're into guns or don't own a gun or it's not part of your interest, it is a tool of the trade. It is his true tool of the trade. I mean, this is what he is, professed as an expert. So this is a part of all the different stories that sort of marry together. And that's why I think it truly is the first of its kind and makes it so unique.
There are a lot of interesting decisions and interesting backstory with Fleming specifically, because Ian Fleming was not a firearms expert. Like the whole reason that Boothroyd is relevant and becomes so important in the background of these stories, like the reason he becomes a character in the book is because Ian Fleming was not a firearms expert and made some really kind of questionable choices, and where he likes to put very specific details about everything that Bond is or does or has. He starts doing that with firearms and comes up with some quirky things that become very interesting to try and unpack. And
is that covered in here? Like, you know, sort of the foibles and the
yeah, I do it in the way that I think you would appreciate, David, because I like the way that you approach and the James Bond radio style, right, where it's celebratory and understanding. It's like, hey, this is a man. This is how he understood the world. This was how he was informed. You know, I don't just say, well, it was silly he carried a 25. Well, no, Ian Fleming himself carried a Browning 25 automatic pistol while he was in naval intelligence. So, of course, his character would carry a similar firearm. That leans through. And then, you know what? Like everything else that he did, he continued to research. People reached out to him and he took advice and wove that into his story. And I think those are fascinating details that, well, people might know some of the Boothroyd story, you know, that's a very common Bond thing, or they might have read The Man with the Golden Typewriter and read some of those letters. The context around all of this is so fascinating. And the primary sources it's taken me down the rabbit hole on have been so cool. Like Jeffrey Boothroyd mailed a magazine article to Ian Fleming from 1952's American Rifleman. So the same year, or 1953, I'm sorry, it's the same year the Casino Royale was published, I believe, if I remember right. The magazine was anyway. And that article and the technical readout from this article is directly transposed onto the page in Chapter 2 of Dr. No, Choice of Weapons. When you have the weapons testing and all of this, it's actually pulled from real life testing that was done, that was recommended by Boothroyd. And I found that article, and that article is covered in great detail in our book. So it's not just about like, hey, here's what Fleming did. It's here's the things that informed Fleming as they looked at the time. Here's the actual experts of that era telling him what to do and him following down the path. And the same goes with John Gardner, and the same goes with every author, and like why it was important that those decisions were made. Because I think this is talked about quite a bit, but what makes the Fleming novels so eternal, and really any of the Bond books, is they're like a time capsule. You open it up and you can read, and you are immersed into that world. And just in the same way that his Bentley and the tailoring and the language used, that's very intentional by Fleming, whether you appreciate it or not, tells you a story of what that world was like through his eyes. Those guns are equally as important to that story. And that's why when we wrote this book, I couldn't just go, yeah, here's a gun. It's the gun matched with the tailoring, matched with the watches, matched with the cocktails. It's an integral part of the world. And in the same way that it would do a disservice to just talk about the watches of James Bond on their own, it's a disservice to just talk about the guns in their own bubble, because the puzzle pieces don't exist without one another.
As you're going on, Caleb, because I've known you for years, and I see the passion in your eyes, I've got to ask Ian a question. You're not allowed to kick him under the table. Ian, was there ever a moment, especially with your background with the publishing, where you had to kind of look at Caleb and go, dude, too much.
There's been a couple little bits like that. Now, so the funny thing to me, behind the scenes stuff here, is there have been places where Caleb takes some things for granted because it's so ingrained in him and he knows it so well that he looks at the more obscure stuff and he's like, ooh, like this is more novel to me. I'm discovering new things about the asp from Gardner's books. And focusing on some of those. And there was one point where I had to say, look, we really need to actually bring the PPK up a little bit, highlight this a little more, because so much of our readership is going to be like, that's the one gun they're really going to recognize. And we need to make sure we cover it adequately. And Caleb's over here digging into the really esoteric ones, which is great. But we have to balance them a little bit. So,
I think the fascinating part, to his point, was like, I would say something flippantly on a call about like the Boothroyd story, or about how, you know, Wolf Heinz Flaumer, the lovely gentleman that I got to meet, the owner of Walther Arms when I went out there, about him hand delivering the P99 on set and all the intricacies about that. I'm like, well, you know, like that's a story that most people know. He's like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Hold on.
You're saying the owner delivered a gun to the set and it got into the movie because of him? I'm like,
and it was a pre-production prototype?
Yeah.
Like that's why it looks different than what you can actually find commercially, is because it was a one-of-a-kind prototype delivered for the movie set specifically because Walther knew what they were doing.
But this is why the Cagney-Lacey partnership with the two of you works so well, in the sense that, Ian, you could look at him and go, hey, the story about delivering it on set, people are going to talk about to others. They're going to share that online, and that's going to make people get the book, as opposed to, the Ask. Did you know it had a see-through handle that was 2 millimeters? It's like fascinating,
right.
but there's 6 more Calebs out there in the world, maybe. But I hear you. And Caleb, you said something. Okay.
I think it's been a really good partnership here. Like it's been a really good way to match our specialty and our proficiency at Headstamp with Caleb's proficiency on Bond. It's going to be an awesome book.
I love that. And by the way, there's so much anticipation for this. There was a little bit of a surprise for me. And Caleb, you hinted 007 minutes ago about it when you mentioned watches.
Yeah.
You said that this book also has lifestyle.
Yes.
I loved how you put it. What was it? Non-incendiary, non-firing moments.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I couldn't make this exist in a vacuum because it didn't feel right to me. So actually the first photo shoot we did for this book was at SHOT Show a few years back, which happens in Las Vegas. And if you know a Bond collector in Vegas, you might know where this is going. But a dear friend of ours, Lorenzo, Omega Bond Watches, was kind enough to bring his entire Omega collection to a makeshift studio in a hotel room that we had put together so we could do lifestyle photography of all the Omegas. So we could, in this volume, also celebrate those pieces. And another collector friend of mine happens to have all of the accurate Seikos. So we were able to kind of fold in some of that stuff. And because, and again, while the watch section isn't going to cover every timepiece on the wrist ever, it's going to talk about that story. I wrote an article. It was actually how we quietly announced this book was happening a couple years back now, about a year and a half ago, with Watches of Espionage. I don't know if you're familiar with that watch blog, but he's a great friend, and he asked me to write he called it a counter argument to, he had written an article demanding why James Bond should wear a Rolex and a Rolex only, because Ian Fleming and rah. And he's like, could you write the counter argument for Omega? James Rupley does a lot of photography for that site. And he's like, hey, if you want a counter argument, I got this guy, and we just did these photos like not last month. You should talk to him. And so I wrote not a counter argument, but hey, here's the nuance behind how Rolex was included, how Omega was included, how Tag Heuer's been included. Here's why it was an organic, authentic moment for Lindy Hemming to bring it in. And then here's how that turned into the brand partnership you now know today. And it's disingenuous to just call it product placement because that's not what it came from. And we did all that research as kind of like a teaser for folks to go, hey, I know this is about watches, but if you like the level of detail and research you're reading about a watch and how it appeared in a film here, wait till you read our book about the guns as well. Right. And that's how we kind of quiet launched it. And that kind of storytelling is, to me, really important. And it's also included in the book. We also talk about like the tailoring of Bond. Some great subject matter experts out there that we might be familiar with, like Matt Spazer, who was able to be part of this project, which was awesome. It's a group effort all around. And this community has been nothing but phenomenal in making it come together. It's so cool.
As Caleb said earlier on, the guns don't exist in a vacuum,
right.
Just like none of the other elements of Bond exist in a vacuum. And looking at our layout drafts, the lifestyle photography does just such an awesome job of putting you in the moment and connecting. Okay, this is like a PPK is not a custom gun. A Beretta 418 is not a custom gun. It's a production line piece that they made hundreds of thousands of. How do you really, like, the lifestyle photography to me is what really associates that with Bond.
Yeah.
You're looking through the book and it's, okay, so our section starts with this picture of the gun in context with what he was wearing, what he was carrying, props, icons from a book or a film. And then, okay, now let's look at the gun specifically. And then we move to the next section and it's like a mental palette cleanser reset of, okay, this is your scene. Now let's talk about this gun.
Yeah. And I had, so if you're familiar with my Instagram photography, where it's like the lifestyle flat lays, that's, I really enjoy doing that for that exact reason. And imagine that cranked to 10,000 because we had an amazing photographer with James Rupley actually doing the capture portion. He had me and Ian running light and bounce cards and all these things. I learned so much watching him work, which was amazing. But to Ian's point, I love showing the world of Bond in relation to those guns. And so it wasn't just, hey, here's a 418. It's like, hey, here's a black and white houndstooth suit with a chamois leather holster I had custom made for this book, and a black silk knit tie with the right Ronson lighter. And let's lay this all out on the right kind of backdrop and take a photo. And you open the section, you're like, ah, I'm in the literary Bond era. It's 1950s. It's Ian Fleming. I can feel that. And, you know, with the difficulty and, you know, the legal hoops of trying to get like licensed photography, which isn't happening. You know, it's just not how like it's more important to me, because it wasn't like just leaving that on the ground. Like, okay, well, shucks, there goes the opportunity to share the world of Bond. When we did our photo shoot, I think they kind of were unexpecting. They said, yeah, bring some things.
He showed up with like a sailor's trunk of Bond.
Of course.
paraphernalia.
I'm not surprised.
I had to borrow my dad's Toyota Sequoia, had all the seats folded down, could not see out the back window for 5 hours driving to this place, because top to bottom, floor to ceiling, tubs and tubs and trunks of basically everything that I owned.
This could not have been a trip that Caleb attended by airplane.
No.
Or with somebody else in tow, because it sounds like. And by the way, I'm just going to say something emphatically. The last thing that people in the Bond community want is another photo they've seen 60 times before. Sure. So the fact that this coffee table, and I'm glad we organically have moved to the, let's call it the bespoke look of the coffee table, because I think people tend to nowadays get away from the fact that a coffee table literally is a book that belongs on a coffee table because it's artwork. Yeah. It is we call it a tome, we're calling it a novel, we'll call it storytelling, but ultimately you want guests and people and your friends to flip through that. You want to take your coffee or, your single malt, and you want to sit down and flip through it, not all at once, but over time as a journey. So this thing has to look beautiful. First of all, I was amazed at the size of it. Now that I'm hearing about these unique, very unique pictures, the dimensionality, the larger in life from a scale standpoint moments, this obviously was a very important part of it, not just the copy, as I say, but the visual and art aspect had to be vital to make this happen.
Well, that's why I had to partner with Headstamp, because they emphatically produce these high quality, beautiful coffee table books. And David, I'll pick on you for a second. When I pitched this book to them, I sent them your YouTube and your Instagram. I said, I can get the gun guys talking about the guns of James Bond. I'm worried about the David Zaritskys of the world. And how I framed it specifically was exactly how you just said it. And you can check the messages. We never said this back and forth to one another, but how you described reading my book is how I wanted someone like you to read the book. I wanted it to be something beautiful that a non-firearm person would be proud to leave out, because it is gorgeous and it has that Bond feeling to it, but that you might not read in one sitting because it is so technical in some places, or but it's somewhere that you can sit down every morning or on a Saturday, break out a section, you read something that you glean, that you find interesting, that becomes cocktail conversation in a week, and you do it again. And I literally framed it as a book that you would sit down and have your morning coffee with over the span of time, have a journey with, and learn from. That was my goal.
That, and having a book that looked good enough that his wife would let him leave it out on the coffee table.
That was a big thing. I said, it can't just be another gun book. It has to be something that looks beautiful, that my wife would approve of.
I will tell you now I'm getting really specific, the color scheme of it, that kind of military blue. But the other thing is the iconography, the shadows of the different guns, the hint of what, the title itself, all those things speak to the Bond community in a very heavy way.
It's all very deliberate, very intentional.
I hope you like everything there, because the blue has been selected, and when you see it in print, I hope you really enjoy it. I'm doing my best to color swatch some of my favorite navy blue Bond suits. So doing fabric matching so that the cover has that intentional look to it. The typography meant a lot to me. I fell in love with James Bond, the novels, through a very specific type of Bond book, which was the 1960s Signet paperback editions, the American paperbacks. And I sent that over to our designer and I said, I would like to have a font face inspired by this, because this to me exudes that era of Bond that speaks to me, and I think speaks to a lot of folks.
Easter egg.
Every small moment of this book that you see, I assure you, has been over analyzed and thought between the hours of 5 p.m. and 3 a.m. with me.
Nothing like you, Caleb. Nothing like you at all. Gentlemen, this is how I want to end this video, because I want to tease this just enough that people pull the trigger. And by the way, I've already seen people who know that this was coming pre-order it. I actually know a gentleman, you know him well, Caleb, that is getting this for his father for Christmas, as well as one for himself, because it is something that can be, it's heritage. It really is nostalgia. It's something you could pass on. But Ian, let's start with you. And Caleb, you're going to answer the same question. Looking directly at my audience, tell them why they should make the investment to get this book.
Because this will tell you the stories that you didn't realize you were hungering to find out about this element of the James Bond universe. And for my audience, it's sort of the parallel explanation of this will tell you the awesome stories that you didn't know you were hungering for about the firearms, the real life firearms that have so much background, like deep background in the James Bond universe.
I love that. It's like you've done this before. I will say the storytelling and getting another different and more complex dimension of a character that we've loved for so long and thought we knew is carrot enough. But Caleb, I'm going to give you the final word as the man who's got the name on the front of the cover. Why would you want your friends, quite frankly, and your brethren to invest in this?
Yeah, it comes down to the word you use to frame your channel, the experience. This book has taken us all over the world. I spent 4 days in Germany with the ownership of Walther, who were so proud to be a part of this volume. And I've had that same experience and touch point with Beretta, with the suit manufacturers, with the watch folks, and everyone who's touched this volume has cared about it so much. And so many people in this community have been a part of the research part of this process. You know, my name's on the cover, but the acknowledgement section is going to tell a huge story of all the people who touched this capstone for me. And so if you're interested in these experiences, and if you deeply care about the storytelling of Bond, not just the firearms, but obviously the guns of James Bond is the subheader, and that is a primary focal point. But the stories of everything encapsulating all that, from Ian Fleming's own biography and background in that world to Sean Connery and Roger Moore, it means so much to me. And I've put everything I can into this. So I hope that that's what you feel when you pick up that book.
Wow. Very emotional and very authentic. I'm going to add one more, because that was fantastic and it's a hard act to follow. Whenever somebody from the Bond community, I won't even put this in quotes, I'll just say makes it, when they realize a particular dream or vision, like you have, Caleb, with the help of Ian and others, you want to support them. You want to help them celebrate. And to me, this book, investment, sharing, telling people about it, is a part of celebrating a very good friend of all of ours. So congratulations. And gentlemen, I cannot wait to get my own, because I've got a perfect single malt I'm going to open up and spend a good evening with it. But thank you so much for making this a reality, both of you.
Well, we can't wait to send it to you. It is, of course, on Kickstarter right now. So check it out. By the way, we didn't even get into it. There's all sorts of exclusive elements in the Kickstarter edition. There are pre-order things that you can only get as part of the Kickstarter.
Special edition covers.
We've got stretch goals in there that people can help us reach. There's a treasure trove. Like, it'll be fun just looking at the Kickstarter page.
We will put all the links below and popping up everywhere in your face. Let's go to it, everybody. Kickstart that baby. All right. Ian, Caleb, thanks so much. Appreciate it. And of course, this has been David Zaritsky for the Bond Experience, and we'll see you real soon. Take care, everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks for watching this episode. If you want to be up on the latest from the Bond Experience, just click on this subscribe and subscribe to our channel. You're going to get all the latest and greatest information, plus some exclusive content. And by the way, speaking of content, here's something especially for you, just because we know you. Talk to you soon.